that you too have been shot and you drove yourself to the hospital and waited like 5 hours before they even saw you.
In the bottom of the head, you know, but.
Terence Crawford took a loss today.
Who shot you? Should we go get him?
I don't know who shot me.
Oh, you still don't know?
I first started boxing, I just could fight. I couldn't box.
September 2008, Omaha, Nebraska. A 20-year-old man sits behind the wheel of his car, counting money. 20, 30, 40, and then the rear window explodes. A bullet tears into the right side of his head. Blood begins pouring down his neck, and somehow, he's still conscious. He doesn't wait for an ambulance. He doesn't wait for someone to rescue him. He starts the car and drives himself to the hospital. Doctors will later tell him just how close he'd come. A tiny change in the bullet's trajectory, and the story we're about to tell never happens. There is no undefeated champion, no world titles, no pound-for-pound king, no Terence Bud Crawford as the boxing world would eventually know him. Because before Terence Crawford became one of the most complete fighters of his generation, he nearly died before anybody outside of Omaha got to know his name. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand where Terence Crawford came from. Long before Las Vegas, long before championship belts, long before millions of people debated whether he was the best boxer alive, there was Omaha, more specifically, North Omaha. This wasn't the version of Terence Crawford walking into arenas surrounded by cameras. This was Bud before fame, before money, before scrutiny, before the world cared about what happened to him. Crawford grew up surrounded by an environment where fighting wasn't limited to a boxing ring. Violence wasn't theoretical, it existed around him, and death introduced itself early. When Crawford was still a child, his uncle Michael was stabbed to death. The experience terrified him. Crawford later remembered having nightmares after seeing his uncle in the casket. He didn't want to sleep alone. He didn't even want to take a bath alone. He was afraid someone might come for him. But fear has a strange way of transforming. Sometimes it makes a person retreat. Sometimes it makes someone angrier. And in Crawford's case, that anger eventually found somewhere to go. A boxing gym. Crawford began boxing when he was 7 years old. And almost immediately, people around him noticed something. He could fight from both sides. Orthodox, southpaw, left hand, right hand. The switch hit an ability that would eventually confuse some of the best fighters in the world wasn't manufactured once he became famous. People around Crawford said it seemed natural, but talent wasn't the only thing separating him. He hated losing. Not just disliked it, hated it. Whether it was boxing, basketball, wrestling, chess, a game of dominoes, winning mattered. If you beat Crawford, there was a good chance he wanted to play again, and then again, until the result changed. That mentality would eventually become one of his greatest weapons. But as a teenager and young adult, that same fire could take him in another direction, because the qualities that make someone dangerous in a boxing ring, the pride, the anger, the fearlessness, the refusal to back down, can become liabilities outside of the ring. And young Terence Crawford was still learning the difference. By 2008, Crawford had reached a crossroads without necessarily realizing it. He had already spent years boxing. He developed a reputation as a serious amateur talent. But an amateur career doesn't guarantee anything. Thousands of talented fighters never become champions. Some never even make enough money to survive. Crawford had talent, but talent wasn't the problem. Direction was. There was almost two Terence Crawfords existing at the same time. One belonged in the gym, focused, competitive, disciplined, obsessed with winning. The other belonged in the streets, quick-tempered, proud, comfortable around chaos, and unwilling to let disrespect go unanswered. For years, the two versions of him existed together. But eventually, something was going to force Crawford to choose. On March 14th, 2008, Terence Crawford officially became a professional boxer. He was 20 years old. There was no massive promotional machine behind him. No championship expectations from the general public. No superstar entrance. No global audience. Just a young fighter from Omaha trying to make something happen. Crawford won his professional debut. Then he won again and again and then again. 4 professional fights, 4 victories. The beginning of something. But nobody could have known just how close that record came to ending at 4-0. Not because Crawford lost inside the ring, because a few months later, he nearly lost his life outside of it. August 30th, 2008. The night didn't begin with a shooting. It began with trouble. According to Crawford's later account, there had been an altercation involving a bouncer, then another confrontation. Police became involved. Crawford said an officer sprayed him with mace. He washed the chemical agent from his face with milk. He got something to eat, and instead of calling it a night, he went to shoot dice. It sounds insignificant. A young man hanging around, gambling, talking, passing time. But years later, Crawford would understand something differently. He shouldn't have even been there. He was a professional fighter now. There was supposed to be a different destination waiting for him. But on this night, boxing felt very far away. Under the streetlights, the dice rolled. Money changed hands, and Crawford was winning. Eventually, he decided he'd had enough. He gathered his money, walked toward his car, and climbed behind the wheel, a 1986 Cutlass. He could have driven away immediately. Instead, he sat there, counting 20, 30, 40, and then, at approximately 1:34 in the morning, gunfire ripped through the night. Crawford would tell police he believed he heard around 12 shots. One came through the rear window of the car. The glass changed the bullet's path, and that change may have saved his life. The bullet struck Crawford on the right side of his head, below his ear, near the base of his skull and neck. It didn't penetrate through his brain. Instead, its path was deflected around the skull. Crawford was bleeding badly, but he was awake, aware, and alive. Imagine that moment. 1 second you're counting money, the next, there's shattered glass around you. Your ears are ringing, your head is bleeding, and you don't know whether the next bullet is coming. Crawford had a decision to make. Stay there, wait for help, or move. And Crawford decided to move. Terence Crawford drove himself to the hospital. Think about what that sentence actually means. He had just been shot in the head, and instead of waiting, he put the car in gear. He drove to Omaha, bleeding, toward the University Medical Center. No championship crowd was cheering for him. No referee was checking whether he could continue. There was no corner, no trainer, no 10 count. Just Crawford, trying to stay alive long enough to reach the emergency room. His trainer, Brian Bomac McIntyre, later recalled the evening. Crawford told him he had been shot in the head. Bomac thought he was joking. Then he realized Bud was serious. He rushed to the hospital. Crawford's family arrived, and the young boxer who'd entered the night 4-0 as a professional was suddenly fighting for something much bigger than boxing. The wound looked terrifying, but Crawford had been extraordinarily fortunate. The bullet had lost its energy and changed direction. Instead of penetrating deep into his skull, it traveled around it. Doctors stitched the wound. There was no catastrophic brain injury, no paralysis, no emergency surgery that ended his boxing career. A fraction of an inch. A slightly different angle, a slightly different piece of glass, and everything changes. Crawford survived. But survival was only the first part of the story, because when Crawford left that hospital, he wasn't suddenly a transformed man. He was angry and he wanted revenge. Eventually, Crawford learned who had shot him, and according to Crawford's later recollection, the rage intensified when he heard that the shooter was bragging about what he'd done. He wanted retaliation, not metaphorically, not in the ring. He wanted the man dead. He told his uncle that he didn't care if revenge meant spending the rest of his life in prison. At 20 years old, after surviving a bullet by millimeters, Crawford was dangerously close to throwing away the life he'd just been given back. This is where the story becomes more complicated than the mythology, because years later, the shooting would often be described as the moment Crawford instantly changed. One bullet, one hospital visit, one revelation, then everything became boxing. But Crawford himself has described something messier. The street mentality didn't disappear overnight. The anger remained. The environment remained. The temptation remained. Surviving the bullet didn't automatically save Crawford. He still had to save himself. There are moments when a person's future doesn't change because they suddenly become fearless. It changes because they finally understand the cost. Crawford had been given a warning almost impossible to ignore. He had children, a family, he had boxing, and he had a future that was beginning to reveal itself. But none of those things mattered if he couldn't stay alive. Years later, Crawford would explain that the shooting changed his life tremendously. He realized something had to change. The people around him, the surroundings, the thinking, the priorities. The streets had already shown him what they could offer. Now boxing offered something else, purpose. For most people, being shot in the head would create a long psychological recovery. For a boxer, there's another problem. Your profession involves people trying to hit you in the head. Every punch, every sparring session, every exchange, it could possibly remind you. Crawford's response? He went back. Less than 2 months after the shooting, Terence Crawford entered a professional boxing ring again. His opponent was Michael Williams. Imagine being Williams. Across from you stands a 21-year-old fighter who weeks earlier was sitting in an emergency room with a bullet wound in his head. Now he's standing across the ring, ready to fight. Crawford won. Professional record, 5-0. The bullet had failed to stop him. Now came the harder part, turning survival into a career. The shooting didn't magically make Crawford perfect. He still had growing to do. He would later acknowledge that the old mentality remained inside him for some time. He still encountered danger. He estimated years later that he'd been shot at multiple times over the course of his life. But slowly, the balance changed. The gym became more important than the street. Training became more important than proving something in an argument. Winning professionally became more important than winning a confrontation that nobody would remember. Crawford began stacking victories. 6, 7, 8, 10, 15, 19. Still undefeated. But outside Nebraska, many boxing fans barely knew who he was. But that was all about to change. In 2013, Crawford received the opportunity fighters spend their entire lives waiting for, a nationally televised fight. And it came with a problem. He was stepping in on short notice. His opponent, Bradis Prescott, was experienced, dangerous, recognizable. Crawford wasn't supposed to become a superstar that night. He was supposed to be the replacement. Instead, he turned the opportunity into an announcement. Crawford boxed, adjusted, controlled the distance, changed looks, and he won. The fighter Omaha already knew had introduced himself to everyone else. But now came another test. Could he become a champion? March 2014. Crawford traveled thousands of miles away from Omaha to Glasgow, Scotland. The opponent was Ricky Burns. The prize was the WBO Lightweight Championship. Crawford wasn't fighting at home. He wasn't the local attraction. He was walking into another champion's territory. And once again, he didn't care. For 12 rounds, Crawford demonstrated the quality that would eventually define his career. The adaptation. He studied, he adjusted, he solved problems. And when the final bell rang, Terence Crawford had become a world champion. The kid from North Omaha, the fighter who had driven himself to the hospital with blood pouring from his head, was leaving Scotland with a championship belt. But something else was happening. Crawford wasn't merely winning fights, he was becoming extraordinarily difficult to solve. Crawford's greatest weapon was never simply his power, it was his mind. Many fighters can switch stances. Few can completely transform a fight by doing it. Crawford could begin orthodox, study an opponent, then shift southpaw. The angles change, the jab changed, the power hand changed, the opponent's defensive responsibility changed. And while they were trying to process the adjustment, Crawford was collecting information. This is what made him terrifying. He didn't simply fight opponents, he downloaded them, round by round, reaction by reaction, mistake by mistake. Then he attacked. The same young man who once reacted emotionally to everything around him was developing into one of boxing's most patient problem solvers. The anger hadn't disappeared, it had been disciplined, weaponized, and controlled. After winning the title overseas, Crawford came home, and Omaha embraced him. Championship boxing returned to a city that rarely occupied the center of the boxing universe. Thousands came to see him. This mattered, because Crawford could have left Omaha behind. Many athletes do. Success creates distance. Money creates options. But Crawford's identity remained tied to the place that created him. The city represented everything: the pain, the family, the danger, the loyalty, survival, but now, the triumph. Omaha was no longer simply the city where Terence Crawford had been shot. It was becoming the city of a world champion. Crawford moved to junior welterweight. New weight, new opponents, same result. He defeated Thomas DeLorme to claim another world championship. Then came Victor Postol, undefeated, tall, dangerous, a champion himself. This was supposed to be the fight that answered questions about Crawford. Instead, Crawford turned it into a demonstration. He adjusted, dropped Postol, controlled the fight, won decisively. Another belt, another elite opponent solved. And Crawford wasn't finished, because collecting championships wasn't enough. He wanted all of them. August 2017, Terence Crawford versus Julius Ndongo. 4 major belts, 1 undisputed champion. Crawford didn't need 12 rounds. He didn't need 6. In the third, a brutal body shot ended the fight. Ndongo collapsed, and Terence Crawford became the undisputed junior welterweight champion of the world. All 4 major belts, one man. For a fighter who spent years overlooked, there was nothing left to debate at 140 pounds. Crawford had conquered the division, so he moved again. Welterweight, where bigger names were waiting, and where the biggest fight of his life would eventually emerge. At welterweight, Crawford continued winning. Jeff Horn, Jose Benavidez Jr., Amir Khan, Kell Brook, Sean Porter, one after another. But Crawford's career entered a strange period. He was widely considered one of the best fighters alive, yet the fight boxing fans wanted the most remained out of reach. Errol Spence Jr., 2 undefeated champions, 2 elite welterweights, 2 men with legitimate claims to supremacy. For years, boxing politics, promotional divisions, negotiations, and timing kept them apart. Crawford heard the criticism. Who had he fought? Was he really as good as people claimed? Could he beat the other elite welterweight of his generation? The questions accumulated, and Crawford remembered every one of them, because doubt had always fueled him. His entire life, someone had been telling him what he couldn't do, and his response had always been the same: to prove them wrong. 15 years after the shooting, Terence Crawford entered T-Mobile Arena in Las Vegas. Across the ring stood Errol Spence Jr., undefeated, unified champion, elite, powerful, respected. This wasn't merely another title defense. This was the fight Crawford had been waiting for, the fight that could define how history remembered him. Many expected something close, tactical, competitive, maybe even controversial. What happened instead was domination. Round 2, Crawford dropped Spence. It was the first warning. Then Crawford began doing what he'd done his entire career: reading, adjusting, punishing mistakes. Spence pressed forward. Crawford met him with counters. The timing became sharper. The damage accumulated. By the 7th round, Spence went down again. Then again. The fight that was supposed to be 50-50 was becoming one-sided. In the 9th, the referee had seen enough. It was over. Terence Crawford had stopped Errol Spence Jr., and with that victory, he became undisputed welterweight champion. He had now become undisputed in 2 divisions during boxing's 4-belt era. The boy from Omaha had reached the summit. It's tempting to look at Crawford's life as a simple story. Young man gets shot, young man changes, young man becomes champion. But real life rarely works that cleanly. The shooting didn't give Crawford his talent. He already had it. It didn't give him his competitiveness that had been there since childhood. And it didn't instantly remove every dangerous influence from his life. What it gave him was perspective, a glimpse of an ending, a version of his life where everything stopped before it ever really began. No championship, no millions, no legacy, no chance to provide something different for his children. Just another young man whose potential became something people talked about after his funeral. Crawford survived that responsibility, and eventually, he understood what survival demanded from him: change. Crawford became a father, and fatherhood changed the equation. He has spoken openly about the difficult experiences of his childhood, about anger, about tough love, about experiences that stayed with him even after success arrived. But Crawford also made a choice. His children didn't have to experience life exactly the way that he did. He could be present, he could provide, he could create opportunities. And through his work in Omaha, he could help other children find the same thing boxing eventually gave him: structure, discipline, purpose. Because Crawford knows better than most. Sometimes the distance between two futures is incredibly small. Maybe it's a decision, maybe it's a mentor, maybe it's walking into a boxing gym, or maybe it's a few millimeters of glass changing the direction of a bullet. There is a contradiction at the center of Terence Crawford. The violence around him nearly destroyed his life, but controlled violence became the vehicle that transformed it. The streets taught him toughness, boxing taught him discipline. Anger gave him energy, boxing gave that anger direction. Fearlessness nearly got him killed. Inside the ring, that same fearlessness made him special. Perhaps that's why Crawford fights the way he does. Calm until he isn't, patient until he sees weakness, then ruthless. Opponents often begin the fight believing they're competing against Crawford. Several rounds later, they realize Crawford has been studying them, and once he understands them, the fight changes. It's controlled aggression, chaos, organized into something precise. Go back to that car, 2008, broken glass, money, blood, a young boxer holding the side of his head. Forget everything that happened afterward. Pretend you don't know the ending. You don't know he'll become lightweight champion. You don't know he'll conquer junior welterweight. You don't know he'll become undisputed. You don't know he'll move to welterweight. You don't know he'll dismantle Errol Spence. You don't know boxing fans will eventually debate where he belongs among the greatest fighters of his generation. At that moment, he's just Terence Crawford, 20 years old, 4 professional victories, almost completely unknown, and bleeding from a gunshot wound. That's what makes the next part extraordinary. He survives, then he goes back to work. Crawford's comeback wasn't one night. It wasn't one fight. It wasn't one championship. It was thousands of mornings, thousands of rounds, thousands of punches, running when nobody was watching, sparring when nobody cared, traveling to hostile territory, taking short notice opportunities, changing divisions, winning championships, waiting for bigger fights, hearing criticism, winning again, moving up, winning again. The shooting may have been one moment, the comeback lasted the rest of his career. That's the part inspirational stories sometimes leave out. Surviving something doesn't automatically make you stronger. What you do afterward does. There are people who survive terrible things and spend the rest of their lives trying to understand why. Maybe Crawford doesn't have an answer. Maybe nobody does. But he knows what happened afterward. He changed his priorities. He became more focused on boxing. He built a family. He became a champion, then a champion again, then undisputed again. And the streaks that once threatened to turn him into another statistic eventually produced one of boxing's greatest fighters. Imagine the alternative. September 2008, a local newspaper runs a small story. 20-year-old man killed in Omaha shooting. Maybe somebody mentions that he boxed. Maybe his trainer tells people how talented he was. Maybe friends say he could have been something greater. Eventually, the world moves on. There is no championship night in Scotland. No Omaha homecoming. No undisputed title at junior welterweight. No Madison Square Garden. No Spence fight. No pound-for-pound debate. Terence Crawford becomes another story about potential. Instead, the bullet changed direction, and so did his life. Years later, millions would know the nickname. But they would chant in arenas, see it on posters, read it beside championship belts. But underneath everything, Crawford remained deeply connected to the people and place that knew him before any of that existed. Before the money, before the fame, before boxing made him internationally recognizable, Omaha knew Bud, the kid who fought, the kid who got into trouble, the kid who survived, the kid who became champion. And maybe that's why his story resonates beyond boxing. Because Crawford didn't erase where he came from. He carried it with him, but he learned how to stop letting it decide where he was going. Boxing measures distance in inches, sometimes less. An opponent moves his head an inch, and a knockout punch misses. A glove moves half an inch, and a punch is blocked. A fighter's foot shifts slightly, and an angle appears. Terence Crawford built a career mastering those tiny distances, which feels appropriate, because his entire career exists because of one. A bullet entered the rear of a car, struck glass, changed direction, and missed the place where it could have ended everything. Millimeters, That's all. Millimeters between life and death, between potential and tragedy, between a 20-year-old nobody from Omaha and a future world champion. But luck only explains why Crawford survived the night. It doesn't explain what came afterward. Luck didn't win the championships. Luck didn't wake him up for training. Luck didn't teach him to switch stances. Luck didn't beat Ricky Burns. It didn't unify 140 pounds. Luck didn't dismantle Errol Spence Jr. Survival gave Crawford another opportunity. What he did with that opportunity was his choice. There is one image that perhaps explains Terence Crawford better than any championship photograph ever could. It's not Crawford holding 4 belts. It's not Crawford celebrating inside a packed arena. It's not Crawford standing over a defeated opponent. It's a 20-year-old kid alone behind the wheel, his window shattered, his head bleeding, driving himself toward a hospital. He doesn't know whether his boxing career is over. He doesn't know whether his life is about to change. He only knows one thing: keep moving. Years later, that's essentially what Crawford would continue doing. When he was overlooked, he kept moving. When the biggest fights didn't happen, he kept moving. When critics questioned his resume, he kept moving. When he conquered one division, moved on to another. When one championship wasn't enough, take the rest. Just keep moving. Maybe that's the real story of Terence Crawford. Not that he was impossible to hurt. He wasn't. Not that he never made mistakes. He did. Not that one gunshot magically transformed him overnight. It didn't. The remarkable part is what happened after. A bullet nearly ended Terence Crawford's story before the world even knew it began. Instead, he survived. He changed, he fought, and eventually, the kid who once drove himself to the hospital with a bullet wound in his head became the man other fighters couldn't figure out how to stop. Sometimes, the difference between tragedy and greatness is measured in millimeters.